Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Melinda Nusafora. President of the United States, Donald Trump, shocked the international community and many within his own administration when he announced US troops would start pulling out of Syria. The Commander-in-Chief said Daesh had been defeated, so it was time for soldiers to come home. He broke the news just days after Turkey announced it would launch a third military operation in northern Syria, targeting PKK affiliate, the YPG terror group. But on Friday, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan confirmed he would delay this latest operation for now. The move would avoid seeing the two NATO allies pitched against each other. Washington considers the YPG its ally in the fight against Daesh and has had troops stationed in northeastern Syria since 2014. This latest operation will be to the east of the Euphrates River, where the YPG controls swathes of land. President Erdogan says the removal of the terror group from his country's borders is vital for national security. It's not the first time Turkish troops have confronted the YPG on Syrian soil. It carried out Operation Euphrates Shield in 2016 and Operation Olive Branch earlier this year. So what do all these changes mean for Turkey's fight against the YPG and its relationship with the United States? Joining me to break it all down is Salim Atalay, who is a journalist at 24 TV. We've got Dr. Marwan Kabalan, who is a political analyst at the Doha Institute. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Mark Kimmett, who was a former US Assistant Secretary of State and a retired US Army Brigadier General. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Marwan, we've got so much to discuss. I'm going to start with you first. So, Turkish President Erdogan said that this operation was imminent. It could start at any moment. Now he's saying we're willing to delay, to let the United States withdraw. What kind of diplomatic wrangling would have to have gone on behind the scenes for both sides to have come to these agreements and this change of tact?
I think the announcement by the US President that he is withdrawing his forces from Syria must have taken almost everybody off guard, including members of his own administration. So I think Turkey and almost all the other players, they really need sometimes in order to understand the implications, the consequences of such a dramatic change in US policy in Syria. Probably we'll see more clarification by Turkey or by the United States also about what that means actually for almost everybody. So I think we need sometimes, everybody needs sometimes in order to understand that.
To digest it. Diplomatically, does it show that Turkey and the United States, that we've maybe mended the diplomatic relations there a little bit because they were strained for a while, or has this restrained relationships?
Well, I think relationship has improved over the past couple of months, in fact, and I think the Americans now, everybody understands that the Americans might be now abandoning their allies in Syria. I'm talking here about the YPG. That should come as good news for Turkey, because Turkey has been over the past actually few years asking the United States to stop actually supporting, financing and training those fighters, because Turkey, as you know, considered them to be terrorist elements. So I think this should, in my opinion, improve the relationship rather than strain the relationship between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you bring up the YPG because, Salim, that's what I want to talk to you about.
Sure.
Does this delay, though, just give the YPG more time to dig in to northern Syria? We've seen them, you know, digging some trenches in recent days. Is this playing into their hands?
Primarily, Turkey was not bluffing. President Erdogan was not bluffing when he called last Friday and informed President Trump that the operation is imminent. That was not a bluff. It was just an ally-to-ally warning that, and it included a pledge and a suggestion that the U.S. soldiers it would be better for U.S. soldiers to stay where they are and not move too much. Now, this delay is just because the U.S. soldiers and the equipment started moving in the area, and there's too much chaos and too many moving targets at this point. Not longer, Turkey is going to move in again Turkey has not indefinitely postponed it. And the reason Turkey was rushing or hurrying a bit was because it didn't want YPG to get any more deep-rooted than it has already been.
So if we are now delaying it perhaps until the new year, doesn't that allow them just to get themselves a little bit more established?
Not really, because they were totally depending on the U.S. support and U.S. logistics and U.S. umbrella. Now that umbrella is gone, and we have reports about France willing to take over, but I think that's just partly humor.
Marwan, what does all this mean in the broader sense of the Syrian war in general? I mean, what's Bashar al-Assad thinking about these latest developments?
The vacuum that is going to be created by the U.S. announcement, the withdrawal of the troops, is likely actually to increase the competition, because Turkey here is not the only actor. This is why I believe that the Turks, they want perhaps more time in order to understand the implications for the other actors also in Syria, because you have Russia, you have Iran, and of course, I mean, you have ISIL. So I think we still need to see how that is going to impact the strategy and policies of all these actors. I believe that we are going to see perhaps more competition. We have heard over the past, few hours that the Syrian regime forces are trying also to take advantage of this U.S. Decision by coordinating perhaps more with the YPG. And we know for sure that the YPG, there is some coordination between the YPG and the Syrian regime. They have actually maintained the relationship with the Syrian regime over the past years, and they have already handed over some of the territories, especially in the northern countryside of Aleppo. So we still need actually to see how the other actors on the Syrian territories are going to react to the U.S. reaction. But for sure, that will increase the competition. The vacuum, the withdrawal of the U.S. forces is going to be open new opportunities for other actors also to come into the fray.
Mark Kimmett joining us from our Washington, D.C. studio. I'm going to welcome you into our discussion now. When President Trump announced that the US troops were pulling out, he said, "Job's done. We've defeated Daesh. They're no more of a problem to us." Before I ask you a question, I just want you to take a little listen to a bit of the video message he sent out when he had made this announcement.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
How dangerous is it, Mark Kimmett, to assume that Daesh is defeated and they no longer pose a threat?
Well, I think, first of all, let's address some of the earlier points that were made. The fact that this announcement was made, the timing may have been a shock, but the fact that the president made the decision should come as a shock to nobody. He has been saying this since he was on the campaign trail, that he was going to get the U.S. out of these types of wars. Number two, the suggestion that President Erdogan was not bluffing about the attack into northeastern Syria was further a compliment on the American side when the Americans said, if you do that, we will take the appropriate measure of force protection. So to prevent a NATO-on-NATO conflict, I think both sides made the decision that perhaps we could find a middle ground, which is for the United States to pull out, which is the right time to do it, and Turkey at that point could wait for 30 days before they come into a part of northeastern Syria. Daesh is not defeated. There's no doubt about that in terms of the overall capability to conduct small-scale operations. But they are defeated for the United States. The United States does not have an existential threat in ISIS. That's for somebody else to finish off the job. The United States doesn't need to be there for another 15 years, destroying Daesh, setting up local forces, participating in peacekeeping missions. That's for somebody else to do, and that's the way that President Trump believes it needs to be done. But to address the point about America leaving and creating a vacuum, nothing could be further from the truth. We are setting up the model in Syria the way we set the model up in Iraq, which is we will provide air support, logistic support, we'll provide training and equipping, but the local forces will do the fighting. It has worked successfully inside of Iraq. It is the Iraq soldiers, the Iraq local forces, the Iraq militias that have destroyed ISIS inside of Iraq. We're going to apply the same method in Syria as we did in Iraq by providing tremendous amounts of air support and logistics. So the American ground forces, which Ambassador Jeffrey said weren't really important on the ground, will be removed, but we're still going to be involved. And any force that somehow thinks that there will be a security vacuum created by the United States needs to look up in the sky, because they're still going to be seeing F-16s up there.
And so you're saying then that the responsibility for fighting Daesh won't now fall solely on, say, Turkey's shoulders. The President Erdogan has said while that they are waiting for the US to withdraw, Turkey will work on plans to eliminate remaining Daesh elements in the region. So are you saying that the US isn't just going to wash its hands of this?
No, I don't think so. Listen, we don't care who kills Daesh. We encourage as many countries that feel threatened by Daesh to go after them in Syria. Whether that's the Turkish forces, we'll be behind them. Whether that's the Russian forces, whether that's in fact Bashar al-Assad's forces. We're agnostic on who does the killing. We just want to see them completely destroyed and no longer a threat to the United States, which they no longer are, but also to our allies in the region, particularly Turkey. So we will support Turkey anytime it goes after Daesh, and we'll thank you and we'll thank the Turkish military and be grateful for their fighting of Daesh.
When the US troops do withdraw, does that leave the future of Syria then more in the hands of countries, say, like Iran and Russia?
Absolutely. The United States' role in Syria was already limited, in fact, because the Americans, they choose actually not to take their leading role in Syria since the very beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011. And now by withdrawing, I believe that role is going to be even more limited than it was before. Don't forget that the US, we thought actually early in the year that the United States has reached a strategy after all for Syria. If you remember, Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, he made that very famous speech in the Hoover Institution in Stanford University in January 2018, when he said that we have 4 major objectives for staying in Syria, militarily staying in Syria. Number 1 is to defeat ISIL completely. Number 2 is actually to contain Iran and deny Iran the possibility of having this land corridor from Iran, Iraq, Syria into Lebanon and the Mediterranean. And number 3 is to ensure that there is a successful political process in Syria that would end up actually with a new government other than Bashar al-Assad government, and the return of the refugees. So now actually we don't know if that strategy is still standing after the withdrawal of the US forces. To me, it seems that President Trump has just dumped all that actually and decided to leave Syria just like that.
All right, well, let's put that question to DC, to you, Mark Kimmett. The future of Syria, is that now more in the hands of Iran? And what does that mean for Iran's power, broadly speaking, in the region? Does this open the doors for more Iranian influence, which the United States has always opposed?
Well, I would note that that Hoover speech, which Marwan referred to, is precise, and he's exactly right. Those were the tenets of the policy put out by Secretary Tillerson, assisted by General McMaster. It's not coincidental that both of them are gone. John Bolton is the National Security Advisor. Mike Pompeo is Secretary of State. So you're right, that policy is out the window, primarily because it never was the policy of the United States. The only legitimate, authorized reason for the United States to be in Syria was to defeat Daesh. Now, all of these other additional missions, I think, started looking like mission creep to the president, and he said enough is enough, particularly after he talked to President Erdogan. The Americans were talking about being part of the political process, training and equipping 40,000 local police. If there had been a political settlement, inevitably there would be peacekeeping forces, and the United States would be part of that. I don't think that President Trump envisioned that Syria, which has already gone longer than World War II, would become another one of our forever wars. That's against what he has said on the campaign trail. And so I think at this point, we never wanted to be part of the civil war, and it doesn't look like we will be. I think the real power players now in Syria will be Iran and Russia and Turkey. But I think Iran's role inside a post-conflict Syria will be significantly diminished, not because of the United States, but because of Israel. The Israeli policy is quite clear there. So, what do I see in 2 years from now? Perhaps a settlement, significant influence by the Turkish government, somewhat influenced by the Russians. UN will be in charge. Iranians will be diminished in their capability, and the United States will be grateful for all their contributions.
Well, there is a lot of developments and still many more to come, I'm sure. Gentlemen, thank you so much for helping us break this down. And I also appreciate you in our DC studio, Mark Kimmett, in our studio in Istanbul, Salim Atalay and Marwan Kablan. Thank you, gentlemen. Over 100 years ago, more than 1.5 million people in Greece and Turkey were forced to leave their homes and told not to come back. The population exchange was part of the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which established new borders after decades of war and tension. But for some people, it's not a distant memory. Andrew Hopkins has more.
2 of these men are Turkish, the other is Greek. But in the 1920s, their parents were forced to leave their homes. Some feared for their lives, others were given no choice but to leave. All were part of what became the 1923 population exchange. Orthodox Christians who had never lived in Greece were forced to leave Turkey, and Muslims who had never lived in Turkey were forced to leave Greece.
They did not know what to do. They had nothing because they left everything behind. What was waiting for them? Just darkness.
Thousands of people tried to crowd onto ships ill-equipped to carry them, camped in dire conditions and facing threats from deadly diseases.
That exchange brought unhappiness to lots of people because it was something painful and hard, but on the other hand, I have to admit that the 2 populations were separated.
The huge exodus was meant to be the solution to a decades-old problem. Under the Ottoman Empire, Christians and Muslims had managed to live side by side, but as it collapsed, tensions increased. Muslim minorities in its former European territories were persecuted, as were Christians in what became modern-day Turkey. After the First World War, Turkey won a war of independence, and that included a 3-year campaign against a Greek army that landed on the Turkish mainland. And it was at that point that the international community decided, in order to prevent any more bloodshed, that there should be a huge population exchange. And this is the story of 2 of the families that were involved. Yanis Glavakis runs a business growing trees in northern Greece. He's also a former member of the European Parliament, but tracing his own roots has also been important to him. Both his parents left Turkey at the time of the exchange. His father Yorgos fled when he was 18, while fighting between Turks and Greeks was continuing. He lost 3 siblings in the violence and told this story of his attempt to leave.
The port was very crowded, and there were Turkish soldiers keeping order. My father was worried his family wouldn't reach a ship. He pushed the soldier, and indeed his mother, grandmother, and 3 siblings could move ahead, but the soldiers did not forget this. He had fallen down, but after he had got up, he got to my father. He lifted his gun to hit him, and my father felt something, and after he turned around, the gun hit him right here. He had the scar until he died. The guy hit so hard that he fell into the sea. He managed to grab the ropes holding the ship. This was how he survived, because he couldn't swim.
Suleiman Mazloum is an architect and university professor in Istanbul. His mother left the village where Yanis now lives when she was 5. She told him few details about her journey. but records show her family had been quite wealthy in Greece, leaving behind 2 houses, 2 mills and orchards, to come to Turkey, where they couldn't speak the language.
Resmi dairede bir işleri olduğunda
When they had something to deal with, at an official building, they didn't have anyone to help them and they were shy. They would sit in front of the building until someone came out and asked if they need any help. If no one asked, they would come back the next day.
On the outskirts of Istanbul is a museum run by the Foundation of Lausanne Treaty Immigrants. It houses an exhibition of items testifying to the lives of those affected and the horrific journeys they endured. Handmade clothes, migration and property documents, and this prayer mat.
5-6 köy, bazıları 10 köyle beraber geliyor.
Not just 1 or 2 villages, 5 or 6, sometimes 10 villages would arrive at the same time. There would be a huge crowd at the port. Diseases would spread, and because of that, and the lack of care and food, people would die on those ships. To prevent an epidemic, they would throw the bodies into the sea. While Süleyman Kara's family was immigrating to Turkey, their baby died on the ship. They kept his body inside this prayer rug so it wouldn't be thrown into the sea. And they kept him until they reached their destination and buried him there.
Süleyman is packing to take a trip back in time to retrace the steps taken by his mother to start a new life in Turkey. He's come with his brother to the Greek port of Thessaloniki, where similar scenes of desperation were witnessed, including by his parents.
Yani şu civarda çadırlar kuruluyor. Tabii binlerce insan.
They stayed in tents that were built in this area. Thousands of people arrived, and the ships were not enough for them. The Red Crescent built tents here. It means a lot to be here and to understand what they felt when they left, not being able to come back.
Çünkü buradan bir daha dönmemek üzere ayrılıyorlar.
Meanwhile, Yanis has travelled to the west coast town of Armutlu, the place where his father used to live in Turkey. Only a bridge which separated the Turkish and Greek neighbourhoods remains from before the population exchange. Yanis has come to meet the town's mayor, who he's known for several years. He brought gifts of olive and laurel trees as a sign of peace and friendship, and is checking on their development.
8 yaşındaki ağaç.
Στην αρχαία Ελλάδα,
In ancient Greece, champions were honored with olive branches.
Süleyman is also travelling, but he is going to Piperia, the village where his mother used to live. Little remains here too of the original Turkish village. There's now a church. His mother's house is no longer standing, and he's not sure of its exact location. Instead, he has to use his imagination.
Muhtemeldir ki
They probably sat here, had a drink and chatted.
But there's one last stop for Süleyman to make, a visit to see his old friend Yanis.
Hey, arkadaş.
They met several years ago on a trip organised by the Lausanne Foundation. They were able to bond over their families' shared experiences and a view that what happened almost 100 years ago should not be forgotten, even though most of those who experienced it are no longer around to tell their stories.
iki halk birbiriyle ne kadar yakınlaşırsa,
I believe that the suffering our families went through will not be repeated if the two nations come closer to each other, understand each other, and build friendships.
yaşanmayacaktır.
We have to make a special effort to make sure both nations understand this suffering and stop it happening again.
Çaba gösterilmesi gerekiyor.
Όταν πάω στην Τουρκία νομίζω ότι είμαι στο μέρος μου.
When I go to Turkey, I feel like I'm home. When I sit in Taksim Square, I see the faces I see in Greece. When I go to have dinner, I eat the food my mom used to make. When I sit somewhere and hear the music my dad used to dance to, I feel like dancing myself. I want to send a message of friendship to the Turkish nation. My friends, I'm inviting you here. I'm happy when you come here. Stay happy.
Yanis' love for Turkey is evident in his collection of memorabilia, including antique postcards from Istanbul, when it was known as Constantinople, and when a huge population exchange involving 1.5 million people was thought of as the best way to deal with a potential international crisis. Andrew Hopkins, Straight Talk.
Yeni cami, Eminönü.
Well, that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Melinda Nusafora. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.